Hi, I'm Hannah Natanson, a national education reporter for The Washington Post. This story follows a Columbia professor who criticized Israeli students, drawing colleagues' complaints and a university investigation. The probe put her job at risk. But it's also a story about the turmoil that ripped through college campuses last spring. The Gaza conflict inspired strong feelings from a lot of people. Students and professors spoke out, and school leaders struggled to handle it. Lawmakers stepped in, trying to shape how schools responded. There was a lot of tension and pressure and fear. I wanted to tell this story because I wanted to show readers what this looked like for one professor caught in the middle of the maelstrom. I reported this story in New York City. Okay, here we go.
This is the main administrative building, so the president's office is on the left.
Katherine Franke was one crosswalk away from Columbia Law School when she spotted the professor who reported her. It had been 7 months since he and another professor accused Franke of harassing Israelis on campus, citing her public allegation that Israeli students bullied Palestinian classmates. More than half a year since the university opened a probe that could get her fired. 20 weeks since then Columbia President Minouche Shafik disclosed to Congress and the American public that Franke was under investigation.
We are currently under investigation for discriminatory remarks.
And just 4 minutes since the 65-year-old tenured professor, winner of a Guggenheim Fellowship, exited the 116th Street subway station in the early September sunshine, headed to her office. As she strode by the university gates, she skirted students shouting, "Free, free Palestine," urging peers and professors to skip school on the first day of class to protest what they called Columbia's complicity in the Gaza war. Now, Franke froze on the sidewalk. She stared at her colleague Zohar Goshen, co-director of the Center for Israeli Legal Studies, whom she'd worked alongside for 2 decades, whom she'd seen at countless meetings of the 90-member law faculty, whom she'd emailed days after Hamas's October 7th attack to ask if his family in Israel was doing okay. Goshen was standing near the curb, talking to someone Franke didn't know. She'd have to pass him to get to her office. Franke thought, what do I do? It was the moment she'd spent much of the summer dreading, even as she devoted hundreds of hours to defending Columbia student activists facing their own discipline cases. The university was probing students' role in pro-Palestinian protests the spring before, when demonstrators erected a Gaza Solidarity tent encampment and took over a building. Shafik twice sent police to clear campus, inspiring copycat protests across America and igniting praise or condemnation from high-profile alumni, billionaires, Donald Trump, and even Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
What's happening in America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned, and condemned unequivocally.
Then came 2 federal investigations into whether Columbia was discriminating against Jewish, Muslim, or Palestinian students. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, an advocacy group, ranked the university's free speech environment as abysmal, placing it second to last in a list of 251 colleges, behind only Harvard. Once classes ended and a dramatic presidential race drew the spotlight, the nation's attention shifted elsewhere. But there was no lull at Columbia, as the school brought dozens of disciplinary cases against student activists. Franke guided nervous undergraduate and graduate students through virtual hearings and watched administrators threaten the harshest sanctions she'd seen, from year-long suspensions to the stripping of degrees to expulsion. Colleagues told her privately that administrators were questioning their classes, syllabi, and events related to Israel or the Palestinian territories. A university spokesperson declined to directly address Franke's allegations of severe sanctions and a censorious climate. Looking outside New York, Franke watched as mostly Republican lawmakers grilled the presidents of MIT, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard on live television.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
Soon after, UPenn's Liz McGill and Harvard's Claudine Gay resigned, followed months later by Shafiq herself. Franke read about professors at colleges in other states, from Arizona to California to Pennsylvania, who said they were fired or punished for speaking out about the Gaza war. All these months later, she didn't know if she'd be next, nor had she decided how to respond to Columbia's verdict whenever it came. She could accept what the university determined. She could draw on her legal expertise to fight any punishment in court. Or she could give up and retire early, because sometimes she was no longer sure she wanted to stay. Could she still teach at Columbia if she could no longer recognize it? Her first encounter with the men who filed the complaint against her, she felt, would go a long way toward answering that question. In preparation, she had read and reread the remarks Goshen and law professor Joshua Mitz cited as problematic, trying to understand. Goshen and Mitz, who have not previously spoken about the investigation, told the Washington Post they took action because school rules required it. They wrote a joint statement. Quote, "We were approached by multiple students who felt that Professor Franke's comment that so many Israeli students at Columbia have been known to harass Palestinians stereotyped them in violation of the university's anti-discrimination policy and exposed them to harassment. We filed an Office of Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action complaint as mandated reporters under university rules." End quote. A school spokesperson confirmed there were others in the Columbia community who made complaints, but not all chose to serve as complainants. Franke, unaware of what motivated the two men, had envisioned asking to sit down and talk it through. Surely, they could find a way to be colleagues again. She remembers being across the street from the law school and spotting Goshen.
I saw my colleague who filed a complaint.
When she saw him, she couldn't bring herself to talk to him.
Yeah, I was anxious about it.
She stared at the back of his head. She glanced at the traffic light, a steady red. She looked up and down Amsterdam Avenue. No cars. She looked at the professor again, still absorbed in conversation. Then
There was no traffic, so I just crossed the street against the light.
she fixed her eyes on the law school, jaywalked across the street, and sailed through the doors. She didn't slow or turn around, not until the elevator hissed closed behind her. Franke had never shied from controversial causes, no matter the blowback. She became a lawyer to defend against AIDS discrimination after watching two of her best friends die with the illness. She didn't care that, in the 1980s, nearly half the nation saw AIDS as God's punishment for gay people. After her graduation from Barnard College and then Northeastern Law, Franke worked as a civil rights lawyer, targeting employers, landlords, and healthcare workers who, she argued, refused to treat people with AIDS like human beings. She came to Columbia as a professor in 2000. Not long before the Supreme Court forced the federal government to recognize same-sex marriage, Franke, a lesbian, opined in the New York Times that legalizing gay unions would be a mixed blessing. Undeterred by blowback from the LGBTQ+ community, she then published a 288-page book called Wedlocked: The Perils of Marriage Equality, explaining and expanding on her concerns. She wrote another book a few years later arguing that Black Americans should receive reparations for slavery. Near the height of the Me Too movement calling out sexual violence and harassment by powerful men, Franke hosted a panel questioning its shortcomings, titled From Time's Up to Too Much? She scrutinized Columbia, too, blasting the university's approach to urban violence, its tactics in contract negotiations with graduate student workers, its attempts to establish satellite campuses in other countries while shrinking the humanities department. Again and again, when she feared administrators were threatening to stymie activism, she stepped in. For example, helping force Columbia to drop a 2017 investigation into 19 students who shouted and marched on stage to disrupt a speech by far-right activist Tommy Robinson. Ariel Sheffy, 26, a recent Columbia Law graduate, said,
"In our organizing circles, she was seen as a professor that we could go to."
Sheffy, who is Jewish, noted that she has never felt uncomfortable around or targeted by Franke.
I know that, for example, my Jewish and Israeli friends at Columbia have found her to be a really valuable and supportive resource.
Over a quarter century in New York, Franke has defended hundreds of students facing university sanctions for protesting over issues from gun control to fossil fuel divestment, she said. After a career built around speaking her mind, she is determined to see students enjoy that right too. Lilia Hajivanova, 34, Franke's faculty assistant, who applied for the job because she admired the professor's track record, said,
"The impression that I had of her is she is a badass. I mean, one of the first things that came up when I Googled her was that she's banned from Israel."
Israel deported and blacklisted Franke during a 2018 trip, but her criticism of the country began nearly 20 years earlier, while she was attending a conference at Hebrew University. After dining at an Israeli friend's house, Franke was shocked when the woman refused to drive the professor back to her East Jerusalem hotel. That was Palestinian territory, the woman said. Those people were terrorists. Something seemed wrong to Franke. Further research, reading, and travel left her convinced Israel was maltreating Palestinians living in the West Bank. On return visits there, to oversee graduate students' dissertations or meet with civil rights advocates, Franke said she saw Israeli government officials collect Israeli trash while leaving Palestinian neighborhoods strewn with rubbish. She saw clean Israeli streets with functioning stoplights while Palestinian roads were cracked and crowded. She saw Israelis and Palestinians forced to walk on different sides of a concrete barrier bisecting the street in Hebron, she said, like they were different species. She began speaking against Israel's human rights record, later boycotting conferences funded by the Israeli government. Advocacy, she said, that culminated in her 2018 ban. When she tried to visit the country that spring, Israeli security officials detained Franke at the airport, alleging she was there to promote the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Despite her denials, they barred her from entering the country. She hasn't been back. An Israeli embassy spokesperson did not respond to a request for comment. Throughout her years of iconoclasm, Franke never questioned whether Columbia would stand behind her. Colleagues might disagree with her, but those conversations always stayed civil. Professors and administrators might dislike her outspokenness, but that was the price of academic freedom, a value she was sure her university would always uphold. So in January of last year, when students rallying to support Palestinians alleged they were sprayed with a foul-smelling substance by counter-protesters, Franke offered to help. When the left-leaning newscast Democracy Now! Sought an interview to discuss the incident, she agreed. Interviewer Amy Goodman asked Franke about the students who allegedly sprayed the substance.
Does the university know who these students were, where they came from, and have they been dealt with?
Well, good morning, Amy. So the students were protesting in the main quad of the university last Friday, and we've had a series of protests.
Franke replied that protesters had examined video from that day and pointed to older students from Israel as their assailants.
And what the students were able to do is examine video from that protest and identify, I think, 3 older students.
The university later determined the substance sprayed was a non-toxic legal novelty item and suspended 2 Jewish students identified as the culprits for a year and a half. After one sued, Columbia reduced the discipline and paid the student nearly $400,000 in a settlement. In the interview, Franke noted that Columbia has for years enrolled students from Israel, where service in the national military is mandatory. And this was the moment that would be notable for Columbia and for Franke.
And it's something that many of us were concerned about because so many of those Israeli students who then come to the Columbia campus are coming right out of their military service. And they've been known to harass Palestinian and other students on our campus, and it's something the university has not taken seriously in the past.
Franke hoped that, this time, leaders at Columbia might listen. After the interview wrapped, Franke left feeling glad she'd spoken in defense of student protesters. She had no suspicion. Her words would force her to defend herself. The 88-page letter arrived in her inbox in February. Franke was under formal investigation by the Office of Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action, which works to keep Columbia compliant with federal anti-discrimination law. Her colleagues Goshen and Mitz had alleged that she harassed members of the Columbia community based on their national origin in an interview. The letter quoted 33 words pulled from her comments to Democracy Now! About Israeli students harassing Palestinian peers.
So many of those Israeli students who then come to the Columbia campus are coming right out of their military service. And they've been known to harass Palestinian and other students on our campus.
If Goshen and Mitz were right, the letter said, Franke had harassed an entire community, violating university policy. The letter said, a determination will be made at the end of a thorough and impartial investigation. Then came 80-plus pages of guidelines and procedures, including, on page 35, potential sanctions ranging from unpaid leave to revocation of honors and awards to relocation of her corner office, or even dismissal or restriction from university employment. Because Franke had tenure, firing her would require a formal action from the president and a faculty committee vote. But it was possible. Franke sat back in her living room, shaken. She couldn't believe her colleagues had escalated to filing a complaint without talking to her first. She had never been close to the two men, at most exchanging brief greetings in the hallway, but now recalled she hadn't spoken to either professor in months. Goshen had replied when she emailed asking about his family in Israel. He wrote, "Many thanks for your kind message of support. Indeed, these are difficult times for me. I pray for better times." Still, Franke assured herself the probe couldn't last long. All Columbia had to do was listen to her interview, available online. She was confident no reasonable person could hear her comments and conclude she was harassing all Israelis on campus. She hired a lawyer but stayed confident, until April 17th, when she heard her name on C-SPAN. Columbia President Shafiq, wearing pearls and a blue blazer, was seated before a House committee, trying to explain how the university dealt with anti-Semitism on campus.
Let me ask about Professor Katherine Franke from the Columbia Law School,
said Representative Elise Stefanik, mispronouncing her last name,
who said that all Israeli students who have served in the IDF are dangerous and shouldn't be on campus. What disciplinary action has been taken against that professor?
Franke's breath caught. That wasn't what she said. Shafiq must know that wasn't what she said, because Franke had sent her a message 2 weeks before the hearing, trying to explain the Democracy Now! Interview after it garnered negative headlines from Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Franke wrote in the message, quote, "I have never voiced a general call for banning Israeli students from our campus. Rather, I voiced concern about students coming onto our campus who have just completed their military service in Israel. The transition to civilian life can be a rough one for some people," end quote. She bolded and underlined the word some. Her president, Franke now hoped, would take this chance to make clear she had not advocated banning all Israelis from Columbia. Shafiq leaned towards the mic and looked up at Stefanik.
I agree with you that those comments are completely unacceptable and discriminatory.
Asked later how she was punishing professors who made anti-Semitic remarks, Shafiq volunteered that Franke was under investigation for discriminatory remarks, noting,
So I just wanted to put that on the record for this occasion.
Stefanik's office did not respond when asked about allegations that the Congresswoman misrepresented what Franke said. Her spokesperson previously told Inside Higher Ed that Stefanik was paraphrasing reporting from the Washington Free Beacon, a conservative outlet that wrote Franke had called on the school to ban Israeli students. Shafiq, asked about her statements during the hearing, deferred comment to Columbia. A university official wrote in an email that Shafiq was expressing her own views of Franke's comments to Democracy Now! Astonished and angry, Franke pulled up Columbia's internal policies. The subject of any investigation, she read, had the right to expect, quote, privacy to the extent possible, consistent with applicable law, university policy, and the respondent's wishes, end quote. Franke had told Columbia she preferred to stay unnamed. She hadn't broken the rules, she decided. Shafiq had. A week later, the University Senate would pass a resolution asserting that Columbia's leaders had disregarded the privacy and due process rights of individual students and faculty members. A Columbia official said the former president did not violate any school rules or policies during the hearing, and noted that Stefanik revealed Franke's name, not Shafiq. Two days after the hearing, Franke checked her office phone to find a voicemail from a strange number. A man's voice came on the line. He mispronounced her name the way Stefanik had.
Looking for Katherine, the anti-Semitic. We're watching you. We know where you live.
Other voice messages followed, one left on her home phone, terrifying Franke's partner, who urged her to call the police.
Hi, Professor Frank. Do you utilize your freedom of speech to attack Israeli students? Now we're going to use our freedom of speech to expose you, and we're not going to let up. It's going to you go bonkers from stress.
Hate-filled emails flooded in too, so many that Franke scrubbed the email address from her faculty page. Franke and her lawyer decided to demand the university refer its investigation to an independent third party, as Shafiq, they argued, had shown bias. In May, the school appointed an outside law firm to determine whether Franke's comments to Democracy Now! Amounted to the harassment of Israelis at Columbia. Franke agreed to abide by the law firm's conclusions and, in June, headed to her lawyer's New York office for a deposition. Over 1.5 hours, Franke remembers, a pair of attorneys kept returning to the same question. Can't you see how these two professors might have felt offended by what you said? Her response: I can't answer what they might feel, but I did not say all Israeli students were dangerous. The same month Franke was deposed, one of the professors who complained about her spoke to the Times of Israel. Mitz, who teaches corporate law and advises the campus group Law Students Against Anti-Semitism, was responding to a New York prosecutor's decision to drop charges against the pro-Palestinian protesters who took over a campus hall. Columbia, Mitz said, should step up security for the fall semester, adding more law enforcement officers and installing surveillance cameras to prevent disruptive demonstrations. Occupying a building, he said, is not a small thing. Meanwhile, he said, it is my hope that the university pursue aggressive disciplinary measures. That must happen. It was exactly what Franke was doing her best to prevent. From her upstate New York summer home, she was tuning in to student disciplinary hearings for hours each week. She joined video calls from her white-walled study, batting away her 2 cats as they wove near the laptop. Completing one such call in late July, Franke folded her elbows on the desk, smiled at her computer, and told the student on the screen that she'd be all right. The student had performed very well, Franke said. She had defended with calm confidence against charges she'd broken Columbia University policy by aiding pro-Palestinian protests in the spring. I would be shocked if they did anything, Franke said to the student, but I'm shocked a lot these days. Yeah, the student replied, the word coming out half-sigh. No matter what happened, she confided, she no longer felt welcome at Columbia. The student didn't know what might happen when she returned to campus, she said. What pro-Israel peers might do. What the university might do. That's a question for all of us, myself included, Franke said, twirling a pen through her fingers. How do we go back? Back on campus in September, Franke was preparing to sign into a different Zoom. She could look out from her corner office upon a changed Columbia. Concrete barriers blocked all paths onto campus. At each gate, private security guards stood or sat inside white tents, checking ID cards as part of a new color-coded system restricting access to what used to be a public space. She still didn't know if or how Columbia planned to discipline her. In July, she'd granted an interview about the investigation to Inside Higher Ed, slamming Shafiq's remarks before Congress and naming Goshen and Mitz as the 2 professors who reported her. Although university policy on investigations allows complainants to file anonymously, Mitz and Goshen hadn't. So Franke said she figured it was fair game to reveal their identities. Besides, she'd already been named to the entire nation. And university investigators had told her, she said, that the process was not confidential. 5 days after the story published, an attorney with the investigating law firm informed Franke the two men had brought a second complaint, asserting she meant to shame, embarrass, and or humiliate them by identifying them to Inside Higher Ed. The second set of allegations, the attorney wrote on July 17th, would delay resolution of the case. The lawyer promised to wrap up within 120 days, but the university had been saying that since February. Franke still didn't know whether she wanted to stay or leave the school. The issue was moot for a few more months at least, because she had long planned to take a leave from teaching in the fall semester. Instead, between meetings with the staff of Columbia's Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, which Franke co-directs, she was continuing to advise those facing university scrutiny. Increasingly, that meant conversations with other professors. Waiting on the other end of the Zoom this September day was a professor at another university in New York. The professor, who allowed the Post to listen to the conversation on condition neither she nor her school be named, was also facing an internal investigation. Hers into whether she responded appropriately to a burst of pro-Palestinian student activism. The professor worried that her college planned to publicize the case, perhaps even to the same House committee that interrogated Shafiq. That would mean national exposure, the professor said, exactly like what happened to Franke. Franke told the professor to try meeting privately with her university's provost, to see if a human-to-human appeal helped. The professor ran a hand through her hair. "This is all very helpful," she said. Franke said, "Oh well, I'm just trying to think out loud with you. It's just such a mess." The professor said, "They are looking for scapegoats. And I think you and I are probably, pretty good scapegoats." Franke settled her chin in her hands. She shut her eyes. She said, Yep, we are." The semester ticked on, the investigation still unresolved. After a few more silent, tense encounters with the men who reported her, Franke formed new habits. She worked remotely whenever possible. On days she had to go into the office, she arrived early and left late. She walked fast. She tried not to be seen. In early October, Franke sent an email to 25 colleagues she considered friends, updating them on the investigation. She wanted, she wrote, to explain my absence. "I do miss being in community with you all, but more fundamentally, I am very concerned about what comes next." 4 people replied. 2 weeks after that, Franke checked her inbox to find Goshen and Mitz had filed a third complaint, alleging she was engaged in retaliation against them. The two cited a tweet Franke posted in mid-October that obliquely referenced the fact they had filed a second objection against her. They also alleged Franke had reposted someone else's tweet calling Goshen and Mitz genocide advocates and McCarthyite bigots. Franke told the Post she had no memory of doing that. When she checked her account and realized she had reshared the message, inadvertently, she says, she deleted the retweet. Franke's public ordeal had begun half a year earlier when a congresswoman denounced her on live television. Now, she was being investigated for her tweets. No one could tell her when it would be over. And then, 2 days before Thanksgiving, it was. On vacation in Mexico, Franke had just finished a Zoom session with her therapist when she checked her inbox to find an email titled EOAA Investigation, Determination Letter. Attached was a 2-page PDF giving the verdict. Guilty on almost every count. The letter stated, "We determined, based on a preponderance of the evidence standard, that your conduct in connection with the Democracy Now! Interview and the retaliation allegations did violate the policy." Her comments constituted harassment of Israelis at Columbia, and she had retaliated against Goshen and Mitz by identifying them to Inside Higher Ed and by retweeting the post that called them bigots, the investigators had concluded. But she had done nothing wrong by tweeting about the two men's second complaint. Asked about the investigation, its outcome, and details reported in this story, a Columbia spokesperson wrote in a statement that the university, quote, is committed to being a community that is welcoming to all, and our policies prohibit discrimination and harassment, end quote. In Franke's case, the spokesperson wrote, quote, an investigation was conducted and a finding was issued, end quote. The letter giving that finding made no recommendation as to punishment. That would be for Franke's dean to decide. But Franke knew, in that moment, that she wouldn't wait to find out. It was no longer possible for her to function as a Columbia professor, she felt. Colleagues had turned on her. She couldn't face students in class without wondering whether they might record and report her. She still believed speaking out in her Democracy Now! Interview had been the right thing to do. But after an entire career waging battles, she no longer had the heart for this one. She felt tears start. She thought, so this is how it ends. On January 10th, Franke retired, severing her 25-year career with Columbia. This article was written and read by me, Hannah Nathanson. Original music and audio production by Bishop Sand.